Thank you, Hari. Thank you, all of you, for coming in this sweltering heat and coming to listen and engage. It's really quite a treat to have Rochelle Potka with us here today. So I want to start off by just extending gratitude to you. I know you've had a very busy schedule because you've been, bouncing from one city to the next, and even in Goa, you have multiple events. So there is, of course, resilience in poetry, but there is also resilience in publishing poetry because I need to talk to people about it.
Yes.
So thank you for coming here.
And thank you for agreeing to this discussion and thank you, Champaka, for suggesting Bhagya. And thank you all for being here. I know we are melting like kulfi. Thank you. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for engaging with this.
This is very poet of us to say gratitude, like starting with gratitude. This has become a gratitude circle, guys. So I want to start, Rochelle, by talking about, of course, Coins and Rivers, because this is the book we are here to talk about. And as I was reading this, I was marking it with my pencil and circling words and underlining words. So it's definitely a collection that I feel will resonate with a variety of audiences. But before we get into the book and also hear you share some of the poems from the book with us, I want to start by asking about your origins as a writer.
Right.
So in one of your recent interviews, you were asked the question, what was your first love, poetry or fiction? And you said, my first love was storytelling. So talk to us about what were the kinds of stories that you loved as a child, and what was your foray into poetry like?
Thank you for this question. I think, it's always nice to look at where we come from. And especially when you write, you're not very aware. It's a subconscious way of creation. And then when you look back, you see footprints and you're like, okay, this was a theme I visited more. So was this a lead motive? Or why did I not visit this theme again? Was I done with it? Did I resolve it? So all those kinds of things. And my influences when I was young were like the very popular pulp fiction, or like say the Nancy Drews and the Hardy Boys mysteries and the Sidney Sheldons. It was very fast-paced, popular pulp because even though I was a good student in school, we would get these gifts of books as prizes. So whatever came in that lot, I never went to buy anything extra. I was not a library person. You would not find me so lonely as to be in the library. You would find me so lonely as to be dreaming.
Okay.
Or you would find me so lonely with one friend, but I was not so lonely to be with with the books. So I was not much of a reader beyond the prizes I won in, for standing first in this or that, or third or this and that. I think for the longest time, I was not a reader, but I was definitely an observer. I know this now. I don't know this then, but that I could consider that reading my influence, because I would read people. I had a big family, of the Goan Catholic community living in Kalyan, which was a satellite small town to Bombay. And Bombay was my aspirational city, but I had this Fernandez family, the Santos Fernandez family, which we were like, the landlords and landladies in Kalyan at that time. And we were a large family. We sold our land and finally all that. We were just one big family. And it was a crazy kind of family. I have written about that family in my poem Gathering in 4 Degrees of Separation, my older poetry book. But I think a lot of my readings came from my relatives and the madcap way they were. Everyone was so funny. And the fun part was that in my nuclear family, my parents fought a lot. They quibbled a lot. So in my nuclear family, I always was surrounded by a bit of fear and anxiety. Okay, what if there's a World War III starting in my family? And at the same time, my madcap large Goan family was the one that kept me balanced, right? Between fear and love and joy and all that madness. And food. Most importantly, food. They were always eating their curries and their sorpotels and their rice and their cutlets. And, there was always feast. So today, food can't be, I don't know how calories work because I'm like, no. Then I would have to minus family out of that. So I think my, influences didn't come from books as much as they came from people and relationships people had with each other. like the uncles and the aunties and their marriages, their parenting skills with my cousins, the crisscross between the Mahabharata and the Ramayans of a family.
Yeah.
So that was what I read. People's faces, or where they are going, why did they say this, why did they do this or not do that, simple things. And I think the dreamer, I also think now there was this gossiping element that is so full in India. I'm sure it's full in the world. People, even Westerners, gossip, but they do so in a very eloquent style. But they gossip, they gossip. But in our family, we gossip simply, right? I mean, like anyone else gossip. I would notice how my grandmothers or my aunties would nickname people, and they would say, that person, no, this is, and we would be just playing and they're half listening. Hey, who's that person they're talking? Who's Rouse, for example? She probably was somebody who had brought Rouse ka fish, and they named her Rouse. So you're like, who's Rouse? So like we are half listening, but we're not. We don't think we are gossiping because we are eavesdropping gossipers. But sooner or later, gossip is what fiction becomes. Because when you are a fictionist, when you are narrating, when you are capturing chronicles, you are actually listening. And sometimes you are crossing the lines of permissions and boundaries because you're listening into people's lives or conversations when you don't have permission. You don't have permission. You might be talking about people's traits, and you may not, to say, have place, but as a creative person, you have place because you're chronicling an imaginative character. So I think there are these kinds of things that affected me a lot. I remember my grandmother would stand at the gate of Violet House, and anybody who was passing by, she would be like, hey, come here, tell me what is in your bag. Where are you going? I think today that is what we do in our minds. We're thinking, okay, where is this person going? What happened? Like, why is this person doing that? Maybe we have better intentions. We don't have intentions of nicknaming or degrading or judging, but we definitely have the curiosity of where is this person coming from, where is this person going, kya hua, how did they cope with this curiosity. So I think that was also there. These were the influences, I think, in the initial days, and it was only when I became an accidental writer during my corporate life when I thought the only happiness I had was writing short stories, which I thought was a hobby. Did I segue into creative writing and then formally did all this? So I formally gossip, formally capture things, but I'm not as judgmental as my grandmother and auntie.
Right.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating because you're talking about this idea of gossip as a form of storytelling and observation, and it's grounded in curiosity.
Yeah.
And also something that is quite interesting is that poetry wasn't, even though now you've published 3 collections of poetry and your poetry is published in various anthologies, it was not your first foray into the writing space. That was short stories.
Yes, it was a short stories.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Would you like to start us off by perhaps reading one of the poems from your book?
Yes. What would you want? Would you want? You tell me, because
So today is Kamala Das's birthday. So
Okay.
there's a poem called "In That Land Under the Sun,"
yes,
which
yes.
references
Okay.
the poet Kamala
yes.
Das. Let's start with that.
And this poem, when I had just the preamble, I had gone to Shegaon, which is one in Maharashtra, and we had gone for some poetry publishing conference. And so this is partly true in a sense, like I'd seen these people and something, I was incensed by something and I just wrote this. So yeah, so some poems have imagination as the basis, but some have reality as the basis of sorts. So in that land under the sun, in that land under the sun, where dry heat hits bone, and in your pocket you keep a red onion to peel flakes at 46 degrees centigrade. Male poets speak of Kamala Das and her feminist poetry, entering a friend's wife's kitchen and directing her to abandon her breakfast preparations. They are getting late. There are no cafes in the neighborhood, yet they depart with a caravan of 15 ravenous townspeople. Under an angry sun, hunger hitting inside their guts, Pipe pipers talk of timeliness, reaching a nowhere wilderness, while the woman, in her four-walled steel cliche, keeps away a mountain of grated coconut over flattened rice, sugar, coffee, and unused milk parboiled. Her father was a village radical, but she tucks her wet sighs at the edge of her sari. As onions shrivel in our pockets with intense upheaval, men use Urdu and Marathi verses to fight God, and the women can't even fight the men who are not their husbands because they know no poetry. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
One of the things that I love about this poem, and you were referring to this inherent curiosity that you developed growing up in a large family, is the specificity
Oh.
of the observations, particularly the line, she tucks her wet sighs at the edge of her sari, or even this idea of like carrying an onion in your pocket, right, in this sort of heat in places like Rajasthan, for example,
Yes.
to avoid the loo or the
Yes.
heat
Yes.
wave.
Yeah.
People will
Yeah.
place onion in their pocket and eat that. So there is this element of, it might not be my reality, but I feel privileged to have a glimpse into someone else's reality in a way that makes me feel something.
Yes.
Which
Yes.
which is very much the power of your poetry. You know,
Thank you. Thank you.
It
And also, I feel that everybody, like who you come across, and every place that you come across is so different in whether it's language, dialect, uh, the ways of people, how they communicate with each other, how they are. Each individual is sometimes. And I always look for the comic. I don't know why. I think I want to always chuckle, but not chuckle at them. Chuckle at how wonderful it is that they don't know what they are. That black comedy element that is in everyone,
yeah.
especially because I saw it in my family, I think,
And
first.
humor is also a cultural commentary, right? It's a way for us to laugh at something that somewhere makes us uncomfortable. So in that dark humor, there is this element of like cultural critique as well.
Yeah.
Lovely. This is your, like I said, your third poetry collection. Your last one, Paper Asylum, was recognized for its versatility in terms of the use of the haibun, and you're also noted for your works in the haiku genre of poetry. So talk to us about the genre or genres of poetry that Coins in Rivers falls into.
Yeah. So while Paper Asylum, that I just have one copy, just I happen to, this is the second, that is a reprint.
Okay.
Yeah. So this one, Paper Asylum. So this is a book of haibun, which is Japanese short prose poetry, which is lyrical, but it's prose poetry. And then you have a haiku. Now, of course, Basho said you could have 100 haiku, but Majale, we can write one haiku properly because it needs the balance of and the juxtaposition of images. And that's not easy because you need brevity, and you need to juxtapose that. I teach haiku haibun in Himalayan writing retreats, and also I know that it can be, you can take it to like a fish in water, but it can also be very difficult. This comes in free verse. Coins in Rivers is a free verse, and is also poetry that is longer, because I think by then I evolved as a short story writer and a screenwriter, so there was always so much to tell that I had to tell myself, stop now, edit, stop. So there was also that, because Situ, Daraza and all the poems, they're running like a train almost in 3 pages. But when you want to capture partition, you can't capture it in less sometimes, because you're capturing an entire history. So it became that train that was going to Sachal Sarmas's, the Sufi poet's Daraza, where he lived. Then there are poems, some of them are short, but generally I feel, when I look at it very, in a detached way, yes, Harry Mendonça, a long poem. So somewhere I think the storyteller or the script writer in me also got hold of this expression, where it was to say so much, and then you say, now stop, please.
Yeah.
That kind. Yeah.
Just a follow up to that
Yeah.
question, when you say like, okay, a long poem, but now stop.
Yeah.
With let's say with a haiku or a haibun, it's easier to to say now it's time to stop or the poem has come to an end because of the structural limitations.
Yes.
With free verse, that limitation isn't there.
Yes.
So how do you? What is your process in deciding?
So I
that
think
ends?
I remember the poem "Knotted Inside Me," which was written, in my book 4 Degrees of Separation, my first kind of book, which is a little more accessible than this book, in the sense that by the time I reached this book, no Pragya, I had reached a certain linguistic pitch, just like you hang out a lot with the language and you express enough with the language, and then it gets more refined. The problem is only that it shouldn't get opaque or inaccessible. Then there's that other fine line that you don't want to, you feel threatened. Are you reaching that part also? It's like the mad scientist in the garage. You are with yourself and you're like, okay, now the world should not get disconnected from what I'm creating. But 4 Degrees of Separation was that time when I was very much more with the world, just with language. I just started being a poet. So at that time, I had written to a different linguistic pitch. But I just forgot your question.
It was just a
Yeah.
commentary
Follow-up
on the structure, and I wanted to know, how do you know no poem ends?
So that time I had written a poem called "Knotted Inside Me." It came out from being a small town girl who's looking at Bombay and wants to go there. And I wrote that poem, okay, and it was kind of an offshoot. I was writing a short story, and that was a residue. But it seemed to be like a poem, okay. And I didn't consider myself a poet. That was a phase when I was still a fictionist, but I wrote these lyrical things, saved them in untitled files, that kind of time. And I remember I was talking to one of the directors in the Tamil industry, and he said, "Okay, I have 5 minutes. What do you have to say?" I said, "See, I wrote a poem. Can I read it out to you? Just tell me what it is. Like, I'm not sure about it." And I read the whole poem, and at one point he said, "Cut." He said, "Don't tell me these 2 stanzas.
Right.
It's already come in here." So I was like, the editor in me awakened to think like a director as to where are you repeating the same idea or imagery, or where are you concluding it when it doesn't need to be concluded. You leave it at a place which the reader will then take it on. So as a filmmaker, he knew I cut those stanzas, and that poem got a shortlist at Red Leaf Poetry Prize. But I understood a very important lesson in editing. So I feel repetition, which is not part of meter. Like ghazals have repetition, pantums and villanelles have repetition, but where you don't need in free verse a repetition of ideas and imagery, you need to have a distance to cut. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm cutting.
All right. I want to pick up on the thread of being with the world, right? And that balance between engaging but also distancing.
Yeah.
And there's a lot happening in the world right now that one cannot help but engage with.
Yes.
So the next poem that I would request you to read, and then I have a question about this poem in particular, is Surrender.
Oh, wow.
So would you like to?
Yes, I think it's on
page 31.
31. Wow, surrender. So a little bit about surrender before I start, because we are jumping register, like from In the Land Under the Sun to surrender. So I think, politically, yes, you had a comment on the politics, right? So for me, my lead motives, the themes that I kept going to, happened to be love and war. War, I think, came from my fact that in my char diwari of my house, when mother father fought, it kind of displaced me. Later, when countries fought, I'm still the child as a citizen, so it displaces me. So there's still a domestic violence going on in the world. So I feel that domestic violence didn't end, or that quibbling didn't end. It's still there today with Gaza, with Ukraine, with Syria. It's there. We are citizens, children of the world. So somewhere war is a lead motive for me. But love is also, because love is the only way that can answer war. It can answer everything, actually, finally. No matter what kind of love. It's not just erotic love. It's motherly love. It's love for nature. It's love for fellow humans. Love is the answer. So I noticed that I kept coming back to it. And at one point somewhere, things merged, like love and war, politics and personal. They start merging for me. So I think when I reach this place, because you always reach a place when you write a poem. It's like almost like you're a metaphysical train, and you stop at these little platforms, and this platform is a poem. So each title is a platform actually.
Yeah.
Surrender is one little platform on the way. I think that time I had also reached a point wherein I thought, what would it be if, as a woman or as a human, if I was completely free? If I was the freest, like if there was absolute freedom, I would have been a country.
Yeah.
Now I know countries are not free actually. They have dictators, for God damn it. But I'm talking of a country that if I was a woman, if I'm so free in this world that I am a country with my own flag, my own anthem, my own insignia, my own, I don't know, military, like I'm that powerful that I have to say. So probably all this came together in this poem. So I know a long preamble, but had to say this. If I were a country, you would be a journalist. And because you are not an empty headed bloke out for a quick fix, but investigative, committed, idealist, I would have shot you down a street and left you to bleed. If I were a country and you my journalist, it would be a civil war, one too many. Revolutions, changes in governments, I would have jailed you and kept you on CCTV. If I were a country and you my journalist, I would have played a wait and watch game to see who wears the other sleep deprived, akin to a Russian sleep experiment. But, but the more you stare, the more beautiful someone becomes, remember. The more you stare, the more beautiful someone becomes. Many pass the cellars of my mind, few the cellars of my heart. I would blink first. I would give in from dictatorship to democracy. If I were a country and you my journalist, I would let you run a free press and media to change the face of an entire nation.
Do you believe that poetry should be political?
So, they say that the personal is the political. I hear a lot about that, and I sometimes have been deliberating what exactly did they mean. But, I'll tell you something more than this. I was thinking about this question of yours coming in the Gadi to this place. Like, I came from Betul, but I was thinking about this. I think that in this world of voice share, fights over voice share, narratives. We are fighting for narratives because this is a world of social media also. This is a world where democratically everyone has a platform if they want to. Everyone has a voice? Question mark. Maybe. More people have voices. So voice is a very important war because if you have voice, you have power. Okay, and whether the voice is in a poem, whether it's in a novel, whether it's in a non-fiction book, whether it's in long form journalistic writing, just opining, saying something is a counter narrative to either something that has already been said or will be said later. Because there will be a propaganda, there will be a fake narrative, there will be counter narratives. And we are in a narrative war sometimes. Like when you see large countries between Hong Kong and China, between Israel and what it's doing and not, constant narrative wars of what is the truth. So I feel uh, not just poetry, any form of writing and expressing is becoming political because you have a voice and because you use that as a citizen to voice it. Doesn't matter whether you speak of love, you speak of something really happening there, an injustice, you speak of a flower, you're still making a narrative point. You are using power in expressing, not just the written word, oral word. So I think that it's the act of narrating in a era of voice wars where is political. It's become that.
There is this, I completely agree with what you said about how everyone has a voice now. There is this democratization of expression through online as well as offline platforms. And in that chaos, often I find that there is not enough listening happening,
Hmm.
because everyone wants to make their voice
Yes,
heard,
yes.
sometimes at the cost of someone else's voice. So it's
Hmm.
about who is louder, who is more influential, and it's
Yes.
connected to power, like you
Yes,
said.
yes.
So what is the role of listening in the expression of this voice?
Mm. So I think sometimes, the art of listening, because this is a very important concern,
Mm.
because listening or silence should be imposed, I think. Not in a way like silencing voices, just the act of silence, the art of silence, which is close to listening, but is also close to reflecting, meditation, and also because all writing eventually leads to a point wherein you think in silence. So I think thinking, then maybe expression, maybe noise, but there is a point when you want to reflect, and that again happens in silence. So I so such a pertinent point actually. Is anyone listening?
Yeah,
Because it, I don't know, it shouldn't become like a Tower of Babel, right?
right.
Yeah.
That's also one of the reasons that I gravitate towards poetry, because like you said, we were talking about this earlier, a poetry collection is not necessarily something you read from start to finish. It's something you read, you reflect on. A line might stay with me, a word, an idea, and I'll reflect and I'll go back to it, and maybe I'll share my thoughts on it with somebody, or maybe I won't.
Yes.
But I think poetry encourages that idea of reflection, because it's very much about being mindful and being in the present.
Yes, yes. And also I think the form, because I write novels, I write screenplays. Of course I'm new, like I'm emerging, I'm like pitching. I write haibun, I write haiku. What I feel is when you write smaller pieces, you're capturing much more energy, because it's so telegrammic, almost like you're transferring that very quickly. Like it takes me 2 minutes to transfer a poem, right? But it'll take me how long to transfer a novel?
What do you mean by that, transfer?
Reading, like the reception of it, reading an entire novel, watching a film, is going to take me 3 hours, or 2 hours, but to get that film made will take me 5 years. But a poem, if I write it today and I think it's ready, I'm saying I think it's ready because I also believe in editing, taking off those extra words and line breaking it properly. Yes, absolutely, I love that. Not rewriting the poem, you can't rewrite a poem, but you can just chisel it. It takes you 2 minutes to read it, 2 minutes to get on the same page with me. So that's the power, right? Of
Definitely.
Yeah. That's why I used to call it the telegrams from the universe.
Yeah, yeah.
Actually, the telegrams from the universe, because they're so tiny. Like telegram aaya hai. Yeah.
So you spoke about the politics of a nation, and if, let's say, if we were a country, or if you were a country, and in some of your other poems, for example, there's a poem titled Rape Fantasies, and there's another poem titled 10 Things I Want to Do to You. It talks about the politics of the body, politics of of sexuality. So I do want to hear more about your evolution of your relationship with your body, with your sexuality, and how that translates to the page.
Yeah. So I think I thought a lot about women's sexuality, because it is so connected to consumerism and capitalism, in the way that in an outside world you're not supposed to be happy with your body, because if you know that you're beautiful as is, you're not going to buy anything that needs you to be beautiful, right? Because you already are beautiful. So you must do surgeries, and you must buy cosmetics, and you must do retail therapy, because you're not good enough, you're not enough. So that's something which happens at one common level, but also in society, you are told, right? I mean, color is a common thing, thinness or fatness, like being fat is a common thing. So I think these are the definitions and standards of beauty that are so external, but you internalize them. So whether it's society, whether it's the TV telling you fair and lovely, or like even now, whatever, like under eye creams and I don't know what not, like I mean I don't
Skincare routine.
I've lost track of the amount of things. Some of them are essential, like yes, you should moisturize if you're feeling scratchy or something, like dry skin, but it's like it should not be under the thing that you're never enough. That's why please do this. It should not be that. You were always beautiful. We were always beautiful. And you can do this as a kind of thing if you want. So I feel sexuality also suffered similarly. more than the beauty standards and the definitions. The fact that what connects to shame, what connects to fear, what connects to guilt, and fear, shame, and guilt were very common, feelings around women's sexuality. You should, if you had very risk thoughts, were you characterless, slut like, shameful? Was this a good girl? Was this a bad girl thing? So, all these kinds of things, which also become black comedy in a society with double standards. Because after a while, I don't know why, but I always reach the Hasya Rasa. The Hasya Rasa, the comic Rasa
Yeah.
of, I can't stop myself from reaching the black comedy of things that what things should be normal are not. So when I was thinking about the sexual violence that is rampant in the world, uh, for women mostly, of course, men and boys also face violence, sexual violence as well. Boys face it, men may face, but mostly it's the women who face sexual violence in India, in many countries, whether it's acid attack victims or it's marital rapes or it's gang rapes, and the world. Then I also thought of desire, because when you have fear, guilt, and shame on one side with sexual violence, you also have desire, and you don't want to talk about desire or keep a safe space which is non-judgmental, because you think there's so much of violence going on. So there's always a balance that needs to be drawn, because you want a non-judgmental safe space even to talk about desire, without having you being like, oh, what does she mean by saying that? So these are things which I played with, because I saw them in society around me. Some affected me, like, didn't I look at the fashion magazines from the Raddi? I did look, right? I mean, I did see, what is this beauty? Do the definitions of beauty keep changing? What about sexuality? How free are we with our love, with our bodies? So I think this has been a constant. This has been also a leitmotif. It comes under love, sexual female desire, or even male desire. Like I remember one of my stories in Bombay Hangovers. The first story is the arithmetic of breasts, and the arithmetic of breasts is an ode to the breast, but it's told from the point of view of the male. So it's the man who is in love with the woman and her breasts, and then he marries her. That's the premise. And then we go on this journey. You haven't read the story, so I'm not going to spoil it further for you. But he goes on a journey. Because why? Of course, it's a kind of a comedy, but it's also, because I had observed so many men talk about the breasts when I was growing up. I saw so many women not say the word breast. So I saw the men say the word breast, but women don't say the word breast, and it's their anatomy. So even I went to one of the breast cancer, one of the breast cancer, like what do you call it, gatherings, because I had written this, because I had said the word breast. So there also they said, "Wo ladies wala cancer." So I'm like, why can't you say the word? So we also come from that shy culture wherein we may not say it, but we can get molested on the street. So there was also rage. There's also rage, but there's also this thing that, okay, this is a fascination. You study, anthropology, and you come to know that the human evolution was that first the male animal was attracted to the female animal uh, by their butts, because they were on their fours.
Yeah.
And when they became bipedal, then they had no butts, right? The butts were down. So when they stood erect, then nature gave a bum-like thing for the anatomy, for the attraction. That's actually anthropology. That's how you evolved. So I even studied that. Talk about research.
Yeah.
I even studied that to give ode to the breast. But I did that because of the rage of street harassment in Bombay. I also did that because of the curiosity of the anatomy, and also to reclaim that it's my body, it's our body. So there's so much of writing that happens erotically because it's our body. I don't want others to tell our stories also. I feel our bodies, like nowadays, there's some very beautiful discussions on women's menopause. This was not a discussion that happened earlier. Now people are talking about it, perimenopause, and when does it start. And I feel, wow, it's a nice comfortable place. We are normalizing things that are happening.
Yeah.
And we're talking about even invisibilizing of older women. I feel beautiful. Talk about it. Talk about the silvering of the hair, right? I mean, many women are wearing their silver beautifully,
Yeah.
and they're talk. So all these things come under desire or beauty for me. It's a very kind of how do you say, like it's under the same umbrella.
Yeah.
And I think somewhere there, so I think the relationship personally to my body, I don't think I took anything very seriously, but I don't think anything was said very seriously to me. Maybe because I'm not that dark, I'm not that tall, not that short, not that thin, not that fat. So I never connected my beauty personally with self-worth. It was always an detachable thing. Even my definitions of beauty, I find everybody beautiful. So I don't find it's not necessarily only a fair person is beautiful to me. A very dark skinned person, a very like any person can be beautiful to me. So I don't have definitions of beauty, or they have broken over time. But yes, I think I like to express sexuality, because I think that's something that India shies away from and has a lot of double standards. In fact, why poetry? This is at least written blatantly, like 10 things I want to do to you, or like lava. But I want to write a lot of comedy, black comedy on sex, Indian sex actually,
Yeah.
and have fun with it. Like, yeah.
Lovely. I look forward to that. Maybe
Okay.
the next connection.
Yes, yes.
There's a particular poem of yours that when I read it, I was really drawn. It's called Capsule.
Mhm.
And I was drawn to its sense of rhythm. And when I read it out loud, it almost sounded like a rap to me. So I want to read it out loud
Yes, yes.
to tell you what it sounds like
I
to
want
me.
to hear that.
Great.
I so want to hear that.
It's called Capsule.
Because no one ever said that,
Yeah.
You are the musician, Pragya.
Also, Eminem, growing
Ah.
up on Eminem, plays a role. All right, so this poem is called Capsule. Our conversations end mid-sentence. Our stories hang on bones. The split-second splitting of eardrums, tube lights, iron rods, switchboards. My spine is a high-voltage shock. All pawns standing have fallen down, crisscrossed. Some burnt, some charred, someone's hand is on my shoulder. A stomach cushions my head, the exhaust fan is on my chest. A disembodied finger carries a briefcase yet. A shoe has left its feet, the proofs of near death. Mumbai 06, 11th July, 6:53 p.m. reeks in chorus of smoke, air rifts in rose quartz. As the evening sun wheels, death comes in pressure cookers, copper wires dangling. Wreck, wretch, wreathing, entrails of deadening silence in fire, nickel, gunmetal. Dissected battleship of RDX, ammonium nitrate, the ruptures of a sinuous breathing. Italy, Lima, Madrid, London, Moscow, Istanbul, or Brussels. I could have been anywhere, in Gainsborough and Platinum. When I stumble upon the train station, ghosts walk up to me. I can see their screams and sirens. My heart is a bomb, and we wait for it to explode.
Wow. Thank you for giving this voice.
It is so strong. Like I can hear the drums in the background, and there's so much musicality, of course, to poetry, but this poem in particular. So I wanted to ask you, what kind of music do you listen to, and how does that influence the rhythm of
Yeah.
what you write?
So I for the longest time I have been listening to Hindi film music,
Yeah.
and I think Hindi film music, yes, other kinds of music, but mostly Hindi films. There will be English music, rock, hip hop, whatever. But I think if you ask me on a day I need to pep myself up, it will be filmy music. Yeah. So maybe that's coming.
Yeah.
Or because this is also a Mumbai train terrorism poem,
Yeah.
which then connects to different countries in the world and train attacks.
Yeah.
Train attacks. Because I love trains so much. I don't know why, but train is such an important part that sometimes metaphysically I think I'm a train.
Yeah.
Like currently I think I'm a bullet train. Yeah. But I think that music, that the beats that are there in the Bollywood, good Bollywood songs, I would say,
Yeah.
yes.
Now that you mentioned trains, it does seem like the rhythm of this poem is the rhythm of a train chugging
Yes,
along the
yes,
railroad
yes.
tracks. as
And
well.
even to Daraza, if you read, to Daraza is another train.
Okay.
Yeah, in 3 pages.
Okay. Like a longer train
Yes,
journey.
it's a long, because it's a train journey from India to Daraza. That is in Sindh, Pakistan.
All right.
So it's like almost crossing not just simple geographical boundaries, but history.
Yes.
You're going to pre-partitions.
Okay. So the last question I want to ask you before we open it up to questions from our audience is, this is your third poetry collection. You've written short stories, written novels. You're now, like you said, a dozen screenplays, I believe,
Yes,
and some
yes.
are being pitched, some are in works, in progress, and you've been honored with many awards. So in short, you are a figure to be reckoned with in the literary scene in contemporary India today.
I hope.
You are for sure. And what we want to know is, what kind of poet or what kind of writer does Rochelle Portkas see herself to be in let's say, the next 5 years?
That's so
What is it
clairvoyant.
that you dream of?
And that's so naughty and so clairvoyant. Because I think I can only share my wish, right?
Yeah.
So I think I'm more veering towards screenplays. Because I think that I have got this very crazy serial entrepreneurship with creative writing. That I will practice haiku for a while, then I'll say everything I have to say in haiku. Then short stories, then haibun, and then say a novel. And then I want to tell larger forms because I've collected a lot. I think along the way we start collecting more and more. We become more and more porous, and we start collecting more smaller details. Then you want more characters to embody them. You want more twists and turns because there's so much more you want to tell. So I think I might end up in the next 5 years, if I'm thinking, okay, now I'm being my own clairvoyant and thinking, maybe I will head towards more screenwriting. Again, I must say that the challenges are multiplied. When I was a poet trying to seek publication, even if it is now it's Hachette, the journey of a poet could never be easy, but the beauty is in the soul fulfilling form. You are so fulfilled because even though poetry may not have, it can't fit in a capitalistic society of ROI. It does give you what money can't buy. Poetry gives you solace, it gives you peace, it gives you semblance, makes sense of the world. In a uncertain place, when pandemic was creating such uncertainties, people all went to poetry to make sense of something. So art is so essential that money can't buy what art produces. So that's the fun part about poetry being in a capitalistic world. So that's why I always find it weird when they say poetry doesn't sell. I'm like, it gives you something too much more than what another product could give you. Potatoes, perhaps.
Yeah, priceless.
Yes. And but I think that screenplay has its own challenges, and I'm getting ready for them because they are again so uncertain that I don't know. But then I think knowing the fact that if I could be resilient as a poet, just pursuing what I wanted with zid and just doing it, I think I might just crack screenplays with that madness. Plain madness, okay? That's it. Like, just you're mad enough to just do it and do it and do it. And then finally, I think something in the universe feels something for you, and they're like, okay, take it. Take it. If you want it that much, you take it. So it has its own challenge, because I'm again an outsider to the film industry, and no one cares who you are outside, but they are like, you stand in the back of the line and you make your way through. You network and you pitch, and you have to have tremendous amounts of perseverance and patience and faith in yourself. I think it's the same thing that I learned as a poet, the same thing as I learned as a fiction writer. The same lessons are here as a screenplay writer.
Well, I speak for everyone here when I say, I'm sure whatever you dip your toes, but it seems like you're dipping more than your toes. You're like dipping all your appendages into these genres that you engage with. And we really just look forward to seeing what Rochelle Portkas creates.
Thank you.
With that madness.
Thank you. And also, the last thing is that I believe that life is always bigger than literature. So if nothing else, I'll just live comfortably, like not having made any of these films, in my lovely little house in Goa. Or maybe buy a little rocking chair and watch a daffodil and a little butterfly, and I would maybe be happy with that as well, eventually. After all the crazy restlessness, okay? But I'll try very hard. I so want to thank you for engaging so well with the book, and for coming out with questions that are so unique that I've never heard them before, Pragya.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's now open it up to questions from our audience. If there's anything you'd like to
Yes.
ask Rochelle about her poetry, about her process, about the book in particular, the floor is open.